Don't buy expensive thread, honestly, just buy the cheap £8 pack. Hey, I'm Tammy and welcome back to my channel. I thought it'd be such a great idea to film a video that shares if I were to start sewing on a budget of around £150 or $180, what are the absolute essentials that I would recommend? I know when I first started sewing, I actually just bought the bare essentials, and then over time I've added to my collection as I've needed more things to grow. It can be so intimidating when you don't know where to start, which is why I thought this would be such a great introductory video for people that just want to start learning how to sew without spending so much money and working with a smaller budget. So the first thing you'll need is a sewing machine, and I have the Brother LS14. It's right behind me and I honestly can't recommend it enough. It is the first machine that I bought and the only machine that I'm still using to this day, and I've been sewing for about 3 years, and honestly it's seen me through so much growth. So the Brother LS14 is currently £85 on Amazon, and I really think it might be one of the cheapest machines on the market at the moment. It's really easy to use and it stands well with time, and not only that, I think it's genuinely very budget friendly, especially when you're first starting out. For your first sewing machine, you definitely don't need lots of fancy stitches. I honestly mainly just use a straight stitch or a zigzag stitch. The only thing with this machine is that you can't actually choose the stitch length. If you turn the dial, you can see the varied stitch lengths, but you can't actually insert a number like you can on some other more advanced machines. But again, if this is your first machine and you're just dabbling into whether you even like sewing or not, this really is a great beginner friendly machine. The next thing I would buy would definitely be a good pair of dressmaking scissors. Now I would spend between £10 or £20 on this, and they really do make a difference when you're sewing. I know it's really tempting just to use scissors that you already have lying around, but when you're cutting out fabric, you need a really good pair of sharp scissors because it will make the cutting process super smooth and so much more easier. When I did first start sewing, I did just use some random scissors I had at home, but when I upgraded to actual dressmaking scissors, it really did make all the difference. So I would actually recommend buying good scissors to start out with, because that can deter you if garments aren't cutting out correctly and then you kind of just have wonky seams as you start sewing. I have these ones and they're really good. They're super sharp and they actually came with a little thread snipper, which isn't necessary, but it is definitely handy. So now it comes to fabric, and honestly when you're first starting out, I would just use old bed sheets that you have lying around. This is because they come with quite a lot of fabric. It's just a really good way of trying out different stitches, different construction technique, and then once you feel more confident, you can actually go ahead with buying fabric for a specific purpose or garment. So if you're looking to buy fabric, I would actually recommend just going to your local fabric market and maybe spending around £2 or £3 a meter and bulk buying maybe £35 worth of fabric, so you can actually just play around with and try different garments and construction techniques without spending so much money. Honestly, £35 worth of fabric will definitely get you a long way. You won't feel super guilty if the things that you make aren't going to fit you perfectly just yet. If you are looking to buy fabric as a beginner, I would definitely recommend any types of cotton. And if you want something a bit drapey, viscose would be good too, but just be wary that viscose does slip around, and the first fabric you really want to start sewing with would be cotton. And then as you get better, you can definitely buy more expensive fabric that is suited more to your taste. But honestly, you really want to make these mistakes on cheaper fabric first, so you don't end up ruining really nice expensive fabric that you wanted to make something out of. So you have your sewing machine, you have your fabric, and you have your scissors. Now it's going to come to learning resources. To be honest, if I were to start sewing tomorrow, I would not spend any money on learning resources until you've used free resources on the internet. When you're first starting out, there really is no need to buy any sort of learning resource. There are so many amazing YouTube videos, DIY sewing tutorials, and then there's obviously free sewing patterns that will show you how to sew different garments without having to spend on those patterns to begin with. Now, I really believe investing in yourself and your education. So once you start to feel a bit more familiar with sewing and you want to invest a bit more into learning, then I would definitely recommend buying some basic sewing books that can show you the different techniques that you could use, and then also obviously buying some sewing patterns. Now you can buy paper patterns, PDF patterns, it depends on your taste, but honestly I just wouldn't rush into thinking you need to buy patterns straight away because there are so many free resources online. I do actually have my own free sewing pattern, the Eti Camisole, which is linked below, and then I would also recommend looking at the Peppermint magazine website because they also have lots of free sewing patterns. Now you'll also need to buy a range of basic sewing supplies, which will make this whole process a lot easier. I would roughly spend around £20 on these items all together. So you're going to need a tape measure, which is something really easy and simple to use to be able to measure your own body. And honestly, it's also very useful to use when you're actually sewing, so you can use it as a measuring guide. So I have this standard one, which is just a normal tape measurer. And then I also did buy a retractable one recently, but that's definitely not essential, but it is really cool to use. You'll also need a pack of thread. Don't buy expensive thread, honestly, just buy the cheap £8 pack from Amazon that comes with like 20 or 30 colours, because that's all you really need to begin with. You can buy more expensive thread like the Gutterman brand, and they are obviously very good to use, but when you're first starting out, you're going to go through so much thread and you just won't need to use high quality thread just to learn basic seam constructions. You'll also need a seam ripper, which costs around £3 I think, and they're very useful to use when you've made any mistakes and you just want to rip out the threads and undo any mistakes that you've made. I think the one I might have came in a sewing kit, but either way they're really inexpensive and super useful to use. You're also going to need pins or clips to hold the fabric together as you're sewing. This just makes sure things aren't going to move around as you're sewing, and it holds them in place so things will line up properly. I use both pins and clips, but I did only start out in the beginning with just pins and they worked absolutely fine. The last basic sewing supply that I recommend would be sellotape, because if you're using paper patterns, you'll need the sellotape to tape the pages together and then you are able to cut out your size. Of course, you will also need paper and a printer if you're using PDF patterns, but hopefully you have one at home or you're able to use one at school or workplace or a friend's house. So the next thing isn't 100% necessary, but honestly it makes such a difference in the sewing process, and that is an iron. Now I've not included this in the budget because most households do have an iron, but if you don't actually have one, you can definitely find one secondhand or on a marketplace. Ironing when you're sewing really makes a difference. It makes everything that much more professional looking, and if you actually compared a garment that had been ironed throughout the process of sewing it with a garment that hadn't, you would definitely be able to see the difference. Honestly, just use an iron. It will make all the difference. It really upgraded my garments when I started ironing seriously between each step. And if you find the garment that you're making isn't sitting particularly right and you haven't tried ironing it yet, this really could be the solution to making sure your garments look actually professional and wear nicely. And there you go, that adds up to £150, around $180, and these really are the key essential things that I would buy if I want to start sewing on a budget. Just remember that you will naturally accumulate more items. You don't have to go and buy everything all at once. Just these key essentials are what you need to start sewing, and then over time you'll just buy extra items that you can add to your sewing collection, and that will help you grow as you develop in your skills. It's honestly just all about starting somewhere and then practicing as you go, and over time you'll get better at sewing, better at learning the skill, and you'll be able to make clothes that you really enjoy wearing and that brings you a lot of joy. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to my channel if you're new around here and like this video. I'll see you in the next one.